Nessa didn't run towards strangers. She hadn't in 2 years. So when Philippa looked up from the kitchen window and saw her daughter crossing the wet grass toward the man crouching at the fence line, she stopped breathing for a moment. Just stopped. Her coffee mug was halfway to her mouth, and she set it down without looking at it. Without looking away from the window. The man hadn't noticed Nessa yet. He was working with his hands, doing something with a length of cedar board and a hand tool that made a low, even sound across the yard. Not hurrying. Not performing. Just working through the early morning the way someone works when they've been doing something long enough that the task itself has become the only conversation worth having. Nessa stopped 4 feet behind him. She had not spoken since the accident. She had not, in 2 years, walked toward any adult who wasn't Philippa, or the rotation of specialists that Philippa had assembled and then gradually let go of, one by one, as Nessa made clear in the only ways available to her that she preferred the quiet. She stood there in her red rubber boots, hands at her sides, watching his hands move. Philippa did not go outside. She wanted to. Every part of her that had been operating on emergency power for 24 months wanted to cross that yard and get between her daughter and the unknown. But something else, quieter, harder to name, said stay. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass and stayed. 48 hours before that morning, Philippa Strand had not planned to bring Nessa to Haverstock at all. The town sat in the interior of British Columbia, 2 hours east of Kamloops, nested against a river that had no particular ambition, and a ridge of Douglas fir that turned the light in late afternoon into something almost amber. Philippa had driven through it once, years ago, on her way somewhere else, and had not thought about it since. Then the property had come across her desk, a former community hall, 8,400 square feet, brick and timber construction, 1938, listed at a price that suggested the current owners had stopped expecting anything from the market, and simply wanted it to go to someone who would do something with it. Philippa ran a small consulting firm out of Vancouver that specialized in adaptive space design, buildings repurposed for medical, educational, or community use. The Haverstock property had been flagged by her associate as a candidate for a regional sensory integration center. Her firm had been contracted to plan. She was supposed to drive out alone, assess the building, meet with the site manager, and be back by Friday. Nessa was supposed to stay in Vancouver with the family her mother had arranged. A retired teacher named Sandra, who had worked with nonverbal children for 30 years and who sat with Nessa's silences without trying to fill them. But Wednesday morning, something had shifted. Nessa had come downstairs before 6, which she never did, and stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas with an expression that Philippa had learned to read not in words but in texture. Not fear exactly, not the tight, sealed look she got before a hard day. Something more like readiness, like a room that had been closed for a long time and was considering the possibility of a window. Philippa had called Sandra and canceled. She put Nessa in the car. Haverstock received them the way small interior towns receive strangers, with a studied indifference that was actually a form of attention. 2 churches, a grain elevator converted into a wine bar that was closed on Wednesdays, a post office that also sold local honey, and enough sky that Philippa felt it pressing down on her in a way she hadn't expected. The air smelled like pine and river water and something cold coming from the ridge. The building was on a side street 1 block from the main road. The site manager, a woman named Bev, met them with keys and a thermos of coffee, and a look at Nessa that was neither pity nor alarm, just acknowledgement which Philippa had learned to be grateful for. Bev said the property had good bones and some moisture issues in the northeast corner, and that she'd arranged for a local contractor to do a preliminary structural assessment. The contractor arrived the next morning. His name was Jasper Vane. He drove a truck that was clean and old, which was different from dirty and old, in ways Philippa had come to understand mattered. He carried his tools in a canvas bag that had been repaired at 1 strap. He walked the building without saying much, stopping in the main hall to look at the ceiling for a long time, then in the back corridor to crouch down and press his palm flat against the baseboard as though he was taking a pulse. He came back to where Philippa was standing with the floor plans and said, "Your load distribution on the eastern wall is uneven. Whoever did the 1980s renovation moved a bearing point without compensating properly. It hasn't caused problems yet. It will. Not a warning, not a performance, a weather report." Philippa made a note and said she'd have her structural engineer look at it. He nodded and went back to work. She had worked with contractors for 11 years. They fell into a few categories, and Jasper Vane didn't fit any of them. He had the hands of someone who had been doing physical work for a long time. But he asked questions that were structured differently than renovation questions. When he stood in the main hall and asked about the ceiling height, it wasn't because he needed the number for framing. It was because he was reading the room, the way you read a room when you're thinking about how a body would feel standing in it. What the proportion would do to a person's nervous system, whether the space would press or release. Philippa told herself she was probably projecting. He left at 5. He came back the next morning with something different in the back of the truck. Panels, thin, curved, bound with cord, not structural material, acoustic. She watched through the hall window as he carried them inside. She watched him set them in the main room and begin fitting them between the old timber uprights. Curved surfaces arranged in a pattern that drew air and sound through the space in a particular way. She recognized the geometry before she recognized what she was looking at. Then she did. She had seen this work in a presentation, a conference in Toronto 2021, on sensory accessible design for children with complex communication needs. There had been a section on a practitioner who had pioneered a specific approach to building rooms that communicated safety through material and proportion. Not signage, not color schemes, not therapeutic furniture, but the actual geometry of the space. The relationship between surface and sound, the way a curved panel could take ambient noise and transform it into something the nervous system could process without bracing. She had not retained the name. She opened her laptop. She searched Acoustic Therapeutic Design BC. Then she added the specific term she remembered from the conference: sensory integration architecture. The third result was an archived article from a design publication, 2018. There was a name. There was a photograph. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked through the hall doorway at Jasper Vane, fitting a curved cedar panel between 2 timber posts, his hands moving with the specific patience of someone who had done this before, many times before, in hospitals, in pediatric centers, in a residential facility for children with complex trauma in Nova Scotia that had won a Governor General's Award for Architecture in 2019. She sat with this information and did nothing with it. This was not how Philippa Strand operated. She ran a consulting firm. She read rooms, assessed situations, surfaced relevant data, and made decisions. She was 38 years old and had rebuilt her professional life twice and her personal life once, and she had learned that information was only useful if you did something with it. She looked at the man working in her building and could not identify the angle. If she said she knew who he was, what would happen? He would become aware of being known. The quality that had made Nessa cross 20 feet of wet grass toward him without being led, whatever that quality was, might close. She wasn't certain. She wasn't willing to risk it. She said nothing. His son was named Kit. He was 9, small for his age, with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read adults before adults notice they're being read. He came with Jasper after school and installed himself on the back steps, with a sketchbook and a container of crackers, and made no demands of anyone. Nessa had been moving through the building in her way, the sideways, careful way she moved through unfamiliar spaces, testing each room at the periphery before committing to the center, and she came to a stop at the window that looked out over the back steps. Kit looked up. He raised one hand, the gesture of someone greeting a neighbor they see every day. Nessa didn't move. She didn't move away, either. She stood at the window and watched him draw. Philippa was across the room and felt 2 things simultaneously. The reflex to go get her daughter and put herself between Nessa and the unknown, and something older and quieter underneath it that said not yet. She stood still and let Nessa be still at the window, and nobody moved, and eventually Kit went back to his sketchbook, and Nessa eventually drifted to the next room, and nothing had happened, and also something had. Before he left that evening, Jasper stopped at the table where Philippa had spread the assessment documents. He looked at a site plan for a moment without picking it up. He said, "The room off the east corridor, the one listed as storage. What was it originally?" Philippa said she didn't know. He said, "The proportions are different from the rest of the building. Someone knew something when they built that room." He picked up his bag and left. She didn't sleep well that night. By the second full day, Nessa and Kit had developed something that resisted categorization. Kit talked, not constantly, but in the measured way of a child who had been taught, or had learned, that silence was not emptiness but space. He talked about what he was drawing. He talked about a creek he'd found outside town, where the water ran over flat shale in a way that sounded different from other creeks. He said the sound was lower, more even. He said he thought maybe it had to do with the shape of the rocks. He paused, regularly, in the way of a person who understands that a conversation has two participants, even when only one of them is using words. Nessa had a notepad. Philippa had given it to her 18 months ago, and Nessa had taken to it slowly, the way she took to most things, testing it at the edges first. She pulled it from her jacket pocket and wrote something and held it up. Kit leaned forward and read it. He looked up. He said, "I don't know. I think the shape of the bottom matters more than the amount of water." He seemed to find this genuinely interesting. He went back to his sketch. Philippa was watching from the office doorway. She had a meeting in 40 minutes she was going to have to take by phone. She stood in the doorway 1 minute longer than she needed to. What she felt watching the two children was not something she had a clean word for. It was relief, and it was fear, and it was something that ran underneath both of those. A complicated gratitude that arrived with its own ache attached, the way that the things you have been waiting for the longest sometimes do. Raymond Collis came on the third afternoon. He was 61, broad in the way of a man who had been athletic once, and had since converted that architecture to something more stationary. He had the handshake of someone who had decided that handshakes were a form of argument he intended to win. He said he'd heard a Vancouver firm was doing a project in the building, and had wanted to come by personally, because Haverstock was the kind of town where people looked out for each other. He had been on the regional development board for 14 years. He walked the building while he talked. He mentioned that his development group had looked at the property 3 years ago, had done preliminary assessments, still had some interest in the site if things didn't work out. He mentioned this in the way that people mention things they intend to be heard. Philippa offered him coffee. She heard everything he said. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness she had learned to produce. Not aggressive, not warm, simply present in a way that couldn't be argued with. He left. She stayed where she was for a moment after the door closed. Then she went back to work. She found the archived records in the regional library the next morning. The library was looked after by a man named Douglas, who had been there since before the building's last renovation and who found everything Philippa asked for without complaint or commentary. He showed her to a table near the window and brought her the development board files from 2009 through 2014 in 3 archival boxes. She was going through the second box when Douglas came back with coffee she hadn't asked for and sat down across from her with the manner of someone who has been waiting to say something for a while and has decided that now is the time. He said, "You're Jasper's client." Philippa said she was. Douglas set his coffee down. He said, "I knew who he was before he came here. I'd followed the work. I had a nephew who was nonverbal. Jasper Vafirm designed the facility he spent 3 years in Alberta. It was the first place my nephew ever sat still in a room without fighting it." Philippa was very still. Douglas said, "He showed up here 4 years ago in that truck, with Kit in the passenger's seat, and a name I recognized and that he clearly wasn't using for recognition. I decided that was his business." He picked up his coffee. He said, his partner's name was Sully. They'd been together since grad school. Sully died in a climbing accident in the Rockies, March of 2020. The facility in Edmonton, the one they'd been building together for 2 years, was scheduled to open the following month. Philippa looked at the table. Douglas said he couldn't go. After Sully, he couldn't walk through those doors. He signed the completion over to his associate, packed the truck, and drove west until the road ran into something he recognized. He bought back his grandmother's property outside town and stayed. He paused. He's not hiding exactly. He just couldn't keep being who he was. He could only be someone quieter. The library was very still. Outside, a pickup was going too fast on the main road and then it was gone. Philippa said, "Raymond Collis came to see you." Douglas said, "Last week," asked what I knew about Jasper. I told him Jasper was the best carpenter I'd seen work in this building, and that Kit was a good kid. He paused. I didn't tell him anything else. Philippa drove back to the building. She came around the corner of the main road and saw Jasper 30 feet ahead, standing at the edge of the schoolyard fence. Kit was coming through the gate with his backpack half open and already talking. Hands moving, something about a science project, something about rock formation and river erosion, his sentences tumbling over each other the way sentences do when a child has been holding them in all day. Jasper crouched down to Kit's level. He didn't wait for a pause. He listened with his whole attention, the way that certain people listen, not preparing a response, not managing the interaction, just receiving what was being said as though it mattered completely. Philippa stopped walking. She stood there for longer than she meant to. What she felt had no efficient name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't tenderness exactly, though it was near that. It was the particular feeling of seeing something clearly for the first time, after looking at it from the wrong angle, when the angle shifts and the thing becomes simply what it is. She walked back to the building alone. He finished the small room on a Thursday morning. The work order had covered the main hall, the 2 offices, and the north end storage access. The room off the east corridor, the one Jasper had noted on the second day, the one with the proportions that were different from the rest of the building, had not been on the list. Philippa smelled it before she saw it. Cedar and something else, dry and clean, the smell of wood that has been worked rather than finished. She stood in the doorway. The walls were paneled in pale cedar. The curved acoustic panels he had been building were fitted between the timber uprights in a pattern that moved the eye without demanding it. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the building, lower than it should have been, lower than a spec would have approved. And instead of making the room feel compressed, it felt like the room was holding something, like cupped hands. A single window, narrow, set high on the south wall, admitted light at an angle that changed slowly across the floor as the morning moved. In the corner, not centered, not prominent, a small wooden chair, child-sized. The cushion was the color of winter light on snow, almost not a color at all. The kind of color a nervous system doesn't have to negotiate. Jasper came and stood beside her. He didn't explain the room. He said, "Kit's inside, if you want to find them." She did. Kit was turning slowly in the center of the room with his arms slightly out, looking at the ceiling, the way you look at something when you're trying to understand it through your whole body rather than just your eyes. He was saying something to Nessa. Philippa couldn't make out the words from the doorway, just the cadence, steady and unhurried. Nessa was standing near the south wall. Her face was tilted up. When Kit finished whatever he was saying, she took one step toward the chair and stopped. Jasper walked out of the building through the front door. He went to the porch. He didn't look back. He simply removed himself from the equation, not abandonment, not absence, but a specific kind of making room, the kind that required knowing what it cost. Nessa stood in the center of the room. Then she walked to the chair and sat down. The room did what it had been built to do. The sounds from outside whined through the fir trees on the ridge, a car somewhere on the main road, someone calling a name 2 streets over, came through the narrow window transformed. Not muted exactly, arranged, given proportion. The curved panels took the ambient noise of the world and refracted it into something the body could receive without bracing against it. Nessa looked up at the ceiling. Her hands, which she usually held close against her sides, were open in her lap, loosely, provisionally, like something that had been clenched for a long time and was considering what it felt like not to be. Then she opened her mouth. What came out was barely sound, a push of air, a shape that the breath started to make and then released. Not a word, not language, just sound. The first sound Nessa had made in 2 years, and it lasted less than a second. Kit went very still. He didn't move toward her. He didn't call out. He looked at her with an expression that was older than 9, the look of a child who has learned not to make moments into monuments, and he nodded once. Seriously. The way you confirm something true. Philippa was at the doorway. She did not know when she had moved there. She was aware of the doorframe under her hand and the plaster of the wall against her shoulder and her daughter. In the small cedar room in the chair that had been built without anyone asking for it. And she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stood there while something in her chest, that had been bearing weight for 2 years, shifted. The sound she made was very small. Jasper, on the porch, heard it. He came to the corridor. He looked through the doorway. He looked at Kit and at Nessa and at Philippa with her back to the wall and her hand at her mouth. and he understood what he was looking at without needing it explained. He stayed where he was. When Philippa came out 5 minutes later, she went and stood on the porch beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The fir trees on the ridge were doing what fir trees do in late October, which is hold their color while everything else around them changes, a stubbornness that at a certain point becomes its own kind of grace. "You knew," she said, not a question. Past tense. He said, "I hoped." The word sat between them in the cool air and neither of them moved to qualify it. The letter arrived on a Friday. It was sent by a firm in Kamloops. 2 pages, formal letterhead, delivered by a process server to the project site at 10:15 in the morning. It alleged that Jasper Vane had been engaged in activities constituting the practice of architecture in British Columbia without a current valid license. His registration had lapsed in 2021 when he stopped paying the renewal fees, and he had not applied for reinstatement. The letter demanded an immediate halt to all construction activities, pending review, and was copied to the Haverstock Regional Development Authority. Raymond Collis had signed the accompanying notice. Jasper read the letter at the workbench. He folded it in half and put it in his jacket pocket, and worked for another hour. Before he sat down on the stack of cedar he'd been using, and looked at the floor for a while, Philippa found out the same way most of Haverstock found out. Through the Development Authority's public notice, which had been posted online by noon, and which was being read by people who had opinions about it, most of them involving Raymond Collis's long history of making things difficult for people who didn't owe him anything. She called Jasper. He didn't pick up. She drove to his property outside town. The place was a small frame house set back from a dirt road, added to incrementally by whoever had lived there over the decades, without much regard for the additions matching the original. It was orderly in the way of someone who doesn't have excess. A woodpile against the south wall, split evenly. A pair of work boots on the step. Kit's bicycle leaning against the gate at the angle of something abandoned in a hurry, and left exactly there ever since. Jasper opened the door before she knocked. Inside, the room that served as both office and dining room was covered in drawings. Not renovation drawings, architectural plans, detailed elevations, technical sections, pinned to the wall with the organized disorder of someone who had been in ongoing conversation with the material for a long time. She recognized one of the floor plans from the archived portfolio she had found online. The proportions, the notation style in the margins, his handwriting she could see now, specific, and also the handwriting of a person who had never put the work away. He explained the licensing situation the way he would explain a structural problem, flat, factual, not asking for reassurance. His registration in BC had lapsed. The renewal window had passed during the period when he had not been doing any of the things that required a license. The letter was technically accurate. Collis had found a real gap. Whether the regulatory body would take any action, given the nature of the engagement and the specific scope of what Jasper had actually done in the building, was a different question. He said Collis was unlikely to win. He said he had not anticipated the public component. Philippa said, "Why didn't you tell me about the license when you started?" He said, "Because it was my problem." She said, "You were working on my building." The room was quiet after that, not uncomfortable quiet, the kind that has weight because something true has been said and both people know it. She looked at the drawings on the wall. She looked at him. She said she would be in touch. Her associate in Vancouver took 4 hours to find the structure. Regional Development Board minutes from 2011 through 2022, variance applications, contractor approvals, consulting agreements, a pattern of discretionary decisions, zoning variances, permit accelerations, exemptions from standard environmental assessment, corresponding with payments to a numbered company registered in Alberta. The registered director of the numbered company was Raymond Collis's daughter. The payments were not enormous individually. The pattern was. Philippa's lawyer said, "He'll withdraw before we have to file anything formal." He withdrew on Sunday. The notice was pulled. A statement was issued citing procedural review and ongoing clarification of scope. By Monday morning, the permit had been reinstated. But the Haverstock Record had already run the story. Not Collis's version, a careful, factual piece by a local journalist who had found the public notice, had looked into Jasper Vane, and had reported what she found. The piece was respectful. It named the facilities Jasper had designed. It named the award. It named the Edmonton Center, which had won a national recognition for accessible design in 2020, and which had opened without its lead designer present because the lead designer's partner had died 11 days before the ribbon was cut, and he had not been able to walk through those doors. By Tuesday, Haverstock knew. Jasper came through the hardware store that afternoon and felt the shift in how people looked at him. Some looked away quickly. Some said something. It amounted to the same shape of attention, the kind he had spent 4 years not receiving, the kind that reminded a person that they had been known as something and that the knowing had returned whether they had asked for it or not. He drove home and stood in the kitchen until Kit came back from school. Kit came in, dropped his bag by the door, and did his homework at the table without being asked. He ate the dinner Jasper made without commentary. He carried his plate to the sink. Then he came and sat down on the couch beside his father. He said, "People at school were talking about you today." Jasper said, "I know." Kit was quiet for a moment. He said, "I knew you weren't just a carpenter. I didn't ask because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Jasper looked at his son. He opened his mouth and found he didn't have the words for what he wanted to say. He put one hand briefly on the back of Kit's head, the way you do when language has reached its limit, and Kit leaned into it slightly, just for a second, and then sat back and looked at the wall with the expression of a child who has said what he came to say and is satisfied. The next morning, Jasper found a folded piece of paper on the workbench. He didn't know how Nessa had gotten there before anyone else arrived. The door had been unlocked since 7. The building was empty when he came in. He unfolded the paper. It was a drawing in pencil, careful, deliberate lines, the hand of someone who had looked at something for a long time before committing it to the page. The small room, the chair in the corner, the narrow window and the diagonal line of light across the floor. In the doorway, 2 figures drawn without labels, one taller, one not. He stood at the workbench in the morning light and held the paper for a long time. The renovation finished in the 2nd week of November, when the interior had committed fully to winter and the fir trees on the ridge had gone from green to the particular blue-gray they become once the temperature drops and stays. Collis had not been seen at the development board meeting that week. The record reported that he had stepped back from public commitments for personal reasons. The pattern his group had found in the files had been passed to the appropriate provincial body, and whatever came of that was going to take longer than the news cycle. Haverstock returned to itself. Jasper did not return to the version of himself from 4 weeks earlier. Something in him had changed texture, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that certain things change when a weight has been set down that you've been holding so long, you stopped feeling it as a weight. The quiet he moved through was the same quiet, but it sat differently. It had stopped being a room he was sealed in and started being a room he had chosen. Philippa found him in the cedar room on the last afternoon, checking the panel fittings, running his hand along the curved surfaces to test the joins. She stood in the doorway. She said, "I want to make you a formal offer, not finish work." She said the name of the project, the Sensory Integration Center, and 3 others in pre-design, all of them serving children with complex communication needs. She said full authority over spatial decisions. She said she would not be calling to confirm every choice. Jasper was quiet long enough that she thought the answer was no. He said, "The last space I designed for a child who couldn't speak. I wasn't there when the door opened." She waited. He said, "If I do this again, I need to be there." She understood he was not talking about buildings. She said, "Yes, the last morning had the specific logic of endings that have been built toward without announcement." Nessa came into the building before Philippa arrived. She walked through the unlocked front door and went directly to the main hall, where Jasper was doing a final check on the floor installation. She stood in front of him. She looked up at him with the focused, deliberate look of someone who has been preparing something alone. She spoke, 2 syllables, placed with care, separated by a small breath, the way you say something when the saying of it is the most important thing you've done in a long time. "Thank you." Jasper did not speak. He went down to one knee, slowly, without hurrying, and looked at her level, and he nodded once. The nod of someone confirming something that cannot be returned, that belongs entirely to the person who gave it. Nessa held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned and walked out. When Philippa arrived an hour later, she knew from the way Nessa was moving, lighter, Not triumphant, but something released, that something had happened. She didn't ask. She let it belong to Nessa. The car came at noon. Nessa stood on the sidewalk in her jacket and her red rubber boots with her notepad in her pocket. Jasper came to the porch steps. The street was between them, enough distance that faces didn't have to be managed. Philippa took a card from her jacket pocket. Small, plain, her name, and the Vancouver office address and a handwritten number. She held it out. He came down the steps and took it. He turned it over. He didn't put it away. The car pulled out. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it reach the corner at the end of the road and disappear between the fir trees. Kit came and stood beside him. He said, "Are you going to call them?" Jasper looked at the card. He looked at Kit. He looked at the empty corner where the car had been, and the trees and the ridge beyond them going blue in the afternoon light. For the first time in 4 years, something came to his face that arrived without being arranged. Not the managed version he produced when he needed to seem fine. The real thing arriving the way real things arrive, without asking permission, and without apologizing for the fact that it had taken this long. Kit saw it and didn't say anything. He just stood there beside his father in the November light, both of them looking at the same empty corner of the road, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who know each other well enough not to need it filled.